Jessica and I are delighted to welcome you to our panel discussion on normalizing relations between the UAE and Israel, context and implications for the future of the Middle East. Thank you for joining us today. We wish we were welcoming you on our Brandeis campus, but if there is a silver lining to this pandemic, it is the ability to engage so many Brandeis alumni, parents, and friends in events like this one over Zoom. Today's webinar, led by two of Brandeis's research centers, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies and the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, will hopefully provide multiple perspectives and some insight, if not greater curiosity, into significance or not of the recent agreement to normalize relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The mission of these two centers is critical to Brandeis's leadership role in the teaching and research on the strategic and complicated region of the world. The Schusterman Center, led by our moderator, Jonathan Sarna, is dedicated to supporting and growing the academic field of Israel studies. It is committed to creating and sharing knowledge about the modern state of Israel, not just at Brandeis, but to a global audience. The center is both shaping and safeguarding the future of Israel studies by educating the next generation of scholars in the field. Through its research and teaching programs, lectures, conferences, grants, publications, films, and art exhibitions, the center nurtures a worldwide community of people who are interested, curious, and knowledgeable about Israel. The Crown Center for Middle East Studies, led by one of our panelists, Samore, is committed to conducting balanced and dispassionate research on the modern Middle East that meets the highest academic standards. During its 15 years of operation, scholars with expertise that spans the 22 members of the Arab League, as well as Turkey, Iran, and Israel, have conducted research that includes the politics, economics, history, security, sociology, and anthropology of the region's states and societies. It seeks strategic collaborations with other leading research centers, such as the one with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., home to one of our panelists today, Dr. Tamara Wittes. The center's faculty teach undergraduate and graduate level courses across many departments at Brandeis. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Director of Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, Jonathan Sarna. Dr. Sarna is University Professor, the highest academic honor bestowed upon a Brandeis faculty member, and the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History. He is past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and is recognized as a leading commentator, if not the leading commentator, on American Jewish history, religion, and life. Professor Sarna's scholarly achievements are many, but he is perhaps best known for a seminal work, American Judaism, A History, which was winner of the Jewish Book of the Year Award. And in 2009, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Welcome, Jonathan, and I turn things over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and nice to see Jessica, and thank you both, and thank everyone in the Office of the President for arranging today's event. We really do have an all-star Brandeis cast of discussants today to help us understand in a much deeper and more comprehensive way recent developments in the Middle East. Let me introduce the panel in alphabetical order, beginning with Professor Eva Bellin, who is the Myra and Robert Kraft Professor of Arab Politics at the Crown Center of Middle East Studies, and also chair of our Brandeis Politics Department. Professor Yehudah Mirsky, currently in Jerusalem, who teaches in the Department of Near Eastern Judaic Studies and is an invaluable member of our Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. Dr. Gary Samore, who, as you heard, is the Crown Family Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, also professor of the practice in the Department of Politics. With us from Ramallah is Dr. Khalil Shikaki, the founding senior fellow of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Tamara Wittes, who is Senior Fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy of the Brookings Institution. And as you heard, Brookings and the Crown Center at Brandeis partner in conducting policy-relevant research on the Middle East. I've asked all of our panelists to be concise because we want to leave time for audience questions as well. If our listeners have questions, please use the Q&A function that's right at the bottom of your screen. And my colleague, Professor Alexander Kaye, who is the Carl, Harry, and Helen Stoll Assistant Professor of Israel Studies here at Brandeis, he is carefully monitoring all of your questions, and we will hear from him just a little bit later. But for now, let me begin with you, Tamara. And my question for you is, why now? Why suddenly, in late summer of 2020, with our minds on COVID-19 and the US presidential elections, why do you think these deals, first between Israel and the UAE, and more recently between Israel and Bahrain, have suddenly come together?
Jonathan, thank you. And I'm so grateful to Brandeis, to the Schusterman Center and the Crown Center for pulling this fantastic panel together. Why now is indeed the question, because we've known, it's been reported and discussed extensively, that Israel has had quiet behind the scenes contacts and a channel of communication with the Emiratis, with the Saudis, and with a number of other Gulf countries for years now, especially as they have seen common threats in the region from ISIS, from Iran, and a common desire to keep the United States engaged in the region on their behalf. So why bring this out into the open today? The Israelis, of course, would have wanted to make this official at any time. And certainly it is a boon to the Israeli government and to Israelis who have long felt a sense of isolation in the region. So the real question is, why did the Emirates decide to move forward with formalizing this relationship? One trigger was the prospect of Israeli annexation in the West Bank. That is something that I think ultimately was important, but more as a pretext and a catalyst than a driver. The real driver for the Emirates in making this official was Washington and what's going on here. Number one, President Trump's search for a diplomatic victory in advance of his re-election campaign. And so the Emiratis saw an opportunity, the closer they got toward the election, to get from President Trump things that they have wanted from Washington for a long time, particularly some sophisticated weapon systems that they are now hoping to finalize a purchase of before the end of this year. And of course, we're in an election campaign, and so they had to prepare themselves for the prospect that they might not have President Trump for much longer, and how to position themselves in a Washington that might be controlled more by Democrats than Republicans. And so this was a way that they could present a new achievement, an early win to whoever is in the White House in 2021, to all of Capitol Hill, and also a way that they could separate themselves a little bit from their close partners in the region, the Saudis, who are in very bad odor with both parties in Washington. So I think that the Emiratis saw annexation as a way to get engaged on the issue. They took a big risk speaking directly to Israelis that normalization could not go forward if annexation did. And the flip side of that, of course, was what was concluded in this deal.
Well, thank you. And maybe we'll turn to you now, Khalil. The Palestinians, of course, have been opposed to both deals, and you monitor them closely. I wonder if you could explain why that is. I think you're on mute, Khalil. I think you have to unmute. There you go.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. The obvious answer, of course, is that the Palestinians see this as losing an asset. The Arab Peace Initiative has been an important element in the Palestinian strategy. They are weak. They rely on the Arabs to give them some backing to facilitate reaching a peace agreement with Israel, one that is reasonable and acceptable to them. With the Emiratis defecting from Arab consensus, the fear, of course, is that there will be a domino effect, that the Arab Peace Initiative will be dead. And in that sense, that is seen as betrayal, as an abandonment by the Arab world and by the major allies. It's not just the Emiratis and Bahrain. The fact that both Saudi Arabia and Egypt have supported this, these are the two most critical partners for the Palestinian Authority. And without them, the Palestinians will be looking elsewhere for alliances and partners. And so this is a major blow to their strategy, to the peace approach of Abbas, the Palestinian president. There is, of course, additional reasons. There is fear that this will embolden the right wing in Israel, that this will lead to major settlement expansion, that the postponement of annexation is something that will be replaced by a gradual process of annexation on the ground, that this would be as disastrous as a legal annexation. Somebody like me who looks at public opinion is worried about how this will impact Israelis and Palestinians. And we actually did a survey already among Palestinians and Israelis. This is a joint survey we did with Tel Aviv University. We haven't yet released the findings, but I must tell you the findings are horrible. We have seen significant decline in willingness to compromise among Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Compared just to a year or two ago. I can't say that this is directly the impact of the impact of the deal. It could be something larger than that. But since this survey was conducted just the day before and the day after in both places, and for 2 weeks after that, we do think that the deal with the Emiratis and Israel might have had an impact, and this is certainly a very negative impact. There are other concerns, of course, that it will force the Palestinian Authority to make a deal with Hamas. Certainly the Palestinian Authority does not want to do that, but the Palestinian Authority has been very weak. You asked Tamara, why now? Well, one of the factors is that the Palestinians are at their weakest point in their history. They are divided between the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas and Fatah. Their leadership has not been willing to take the initiative in any significant manner. There has been no elections, no democracy for Palestinians for a long time. The Arab world after the Arab Spring is no longer interested in the Palestinian issue. So this is all will add more on the negative side for the Palestinians. And the concern is not just about regional realignment that could happen, but also that it will force the nationalists to join forces with Hamas in order to be able to present a more unified position to the rest of the world. For all these reasons, the Palestinians are very unhappy with the situation. I'm not necessarily saying that this will have a dramatic impact necessarily on Israeli-Palestinian relations today. So far, it hasn't had any impact. Although the deal talks about postponement of the annexation plan of Mr. Netanyahu, For Palestinians, it doesn't matter. Annexation remains on the table. And as long as that is the case, the current suspension of relations between Palestinians and Israelis goes on with a very negative impact on the lives of Palestinians and negative impact for Israeli-Palestinian security coordination. That is something that is felt right now, but obviously it could, things could worsen in the future. It is not because of this particular deal, but it's because of the overall situation since the Trump plan, and this being part of that, seen by the Palestinians as being part of this larger picture of a Trump administration that is determined to weaken the Palestinians further.
So let's bring in now Gary Samore, who covers broadly the balance of power in the region. I wonder if you can widen the lens for us, Gary, and give us a sense of the implication of these agreements for the broader balance of power. Khalil talked about what's going on in the Palestinian view. What about more broadly across the Arab world?
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. So as Tamara said, the primary driver for this agreement is the UAE's calculation that it will strengthen their position against Iran at a time when there's uncertainty about US leadership in the midst of the election and uncertainty about the future US military presence in the region. With, frankly, both Democrats and Republicans talking about ending US involvement in the endless wars. So I think the consequence of this agreement for the broader balance of power in the region is very much contested. In the UAE, proponents argue that this is a game changer, a strategic shift that will lead to a new security system. Without saying it, they mean isolating Iran, weakening Iran's position, while the Iranians dismiss the significance of the agreement on the grounds that Israel and the UAE have been cooperating together secretly for many years now. All this does is formalize and bring into the open a tacit alliance that has existed for a long time. So I think there are three factors to look at, which will ultimately determine how important this agreement is for the regional balance of power. The first and most obvious is whether the agreement opens the door to sales of advanced US military equipment to the UAE, and in particular the F-35s, which the Trump administration added as a sweetener to the UAE in order to agree to normalization. And clearly the Trump administration is trying to finalize arrangements for the sale before the end of the year, while President Trump is still in office. And that will include a compensation package for Israel. Defense Minister Benny Gantz is in Washington this week, and we don't quite know what the compensation package will look like, but presumably it will include additional weapons sales or transfers to Israel. It might include dumbing down the F-35s that the UAE receives, so they pose less of a threat to Israel. Whether or not the Trump administration can complete the congressional review process before the end of the year is unclear. They may decide to circumvent Congress, as they did last year, for an arms sale to Saudi and the UAE. And of course, it's unclear whether, if Vice President Biden wins the election, it's unclear whether he would go ahead with the agreement. So that's one factor. The second factor is the extent to which Israel and the UAE, now that they have a normal political relationship and much greater economic and cultural and technical cooperation, does that lead to more overt security and defense cooperation? You haven't heard much of this from the Emirati side, but in Israel, there are strategists who are speculating that this could lead to everything from arms sales to joint military exercises, even Israeli use of military facilities inside the UAE. All of that, of course, is yet to be determined. My guess is that the Emiratis are going to be pretty cautious about engaging in overt military cooperation with Israel, in part to avoid provoking Iran. But as long as the US position in the Gulf is strong, from the Emirati standpoint, that's a much preferred form of protection to Israel, although Israel might be a hedge in the event that the US proves to be unreliable. And the third factor, and I think the most important, is whether or not other countries in the Gulf normalize relations with Israel and therefore create the basis for a more formal system of cooperating on security issues against Iran. And here Saudi Arabia is the most important country in question. At least for the time being, it looks like King Salman is not prepared to go ahead without an agreement between Israel and Palestine on a settlement. But at the same time, the Crown Prince, his son Mohammed bin Salman, seems much more eager to signal his support for the Israel-UAE agreement. And of course, everybody thinks that couldn't possibly happen without Riyadh's support and even encouragement. So I think all of those indicate that in the future, especially if Mohammed bin Salman becomes king, it makes it more likely that Saudi will follow the footsteps of the UAE and Bahrain. So finally, I think we have to remember that the implications of this agreement for the regional balance will, of course, depend on broader factors, most importantly, US-Iranian relations, which are likely to be deeply affected by the outcome of the US presidential elections, and how does Iran react? So far, the Iranians have been very, as I say, dismissive of the agreement, but at some point in the future, the Iranians might try to punish the UAE or Bahrain for what they've done, and that could have either a chilling effect on other states in the Gulf, or it could encourage other countries in the Gulf to move ahead and formalize their relations with Israel as a hedge against the Iranian threat. So bottom line is, too early to tell the full significance, but I've tried to lay out some of the factors that we should be watching in order to make that judgment in the future.
Wonderful, and thank you. And let's now move then to Jerusalem, where Yehudah is located, and give us a sense, if you could, how is all of this playing out in Israeli domestic politics? These deals kind of hit just as Israel was confronting the challenge of COVID-19 and various other political challenges. I wonder if you can give us an Israeli perspective.
Sure. Thanks, and thanks to everyone for pulling this together. It's great to see everybody. So generally, of course, you know, these agreements have generated some discussion, some notice, but not a whole lot of fanfare, right? Not a whole lot of cheering in the streets and that kind of thing. And I think there's essentially three reasons for that. One, people are understandably, as you said a moment ago, very focused on COVID-19, right? And very focused on the total hash of things that the Israeli government has made. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for Israel's dreadful effort on COVID-19. Some of them are of long standing, you know, is starting since the 1970s, Israel's been facing decline in numbers of hospital beds per capita, that sort of thing. All kinds of, as elsewhere in the world, those sorts of deficiencies in the health system have sort of come home to roost. But some of the issues that are driving Israel's COVID crises are very political, and they sort of color how people see other political developments. You know, this bloated coalition government, right, with, you know, 36 ministers and 16 deputies, means that all kinds of government ministries have been split up, reorganized. You're adding whole nother layers of bureaucratic complexity to all of this. Crucially, Netanyahu is very beholden to his coalition partners, especially the ultra-Orthodox, who, as we know, again, I'm talking mainly about Jewish Israel, these ultra-Orthodox coalition partners who are very resistant to any sorts of closure. He reopened very quickly, etc. And of course, he's very reluctant to let people to adopt good ideas when they're presented by political rivals of his, like Naftali Bennett and so forth.
So what's going on now with
So that's the COVID piece of it, and COVID is just, you know, people are arguing about like whether or not the synagogues will be open in Yom Kippur. So that sort of occupies the mind. Second, why this hasn't been, it's been discussed but not hugely discussed, is it's been said this isn't an earth-shattering agreement, right? Israel's relations with these countries have been an open secret for a long time. Even little old me, 15 years ago, the Israeli Foreign Ministry sent me to one of the Gulf states to officially represent Israel at some international conference. So, I mean, these things have been happening for a while. Crucially, I'd put it like this. The Israeli public, I think, understands that this is a transaction. This isn't peacemaking in any grand sort of way, right? This is a transaction between states, and it's a pretty good one. I mean, nobody, you know, not many people in Israel think this is a bad thing. I mean, you know, there's somebody's going to say this is a bad thing with one or two minor exceptions. Crucially, this wasn't an existential decision. The Israeli public understands that Israel's existential conflict, the one that determines the character of the Israeli state and Israel's future, is Israel's unresolved issues with the Palestinians. And they know that. You know, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have any ideas for it. There's all sorts of reasons why that's at a stalemate. But whatever it is whatever it takes to get that done, Israelis know that this isn't it. And then sort of finally my third point, as a result, these agreements, I think, don't change much in Israeli politics. They sort of reinforce people's pre-existing views. If you thought that Netanyahu was a diplomatic colossus, a world-class statesman broadly bestriding the global stage, well, there, you know, you have confirmation. If you think he's a conniver who can't be trusted and will do anything to survive another day, well, you have plenty of confirmation for that too. I mean, in the distrust of Netanyahu, I mean, it's fascinating that he's the inevitable prime minister all the time, and yet nobody in the country trusts him. Something that's often missed is that the Israeli right really doesn't trust him. As far as you read, like, on the Israeli right, the Israeli heart and ideological right, they feel very betrayed by him now. He promised them annexation, which is something they really wanted, and he sold them out. And some of them will say, well, maybe we didn't like do a good enough job of ceding it to the Israeli public. Somebody said, well, the lesson is that you can never trust Netanyahu. And also on the right, this has given new ammunition to a number of his critics, including the center. You mentioned Benny Gantz. These former military people, somebody who's been extremely vocal here is Moshe Bovi Ya'alon, former military chief of staff and defense minister, who's basically been saying, like, what is this? This man conducts negotiations in secret, creates some agreement with these countries involving all kinds of arms sales to people who, like, however we slice it, are not people who share our values, and only marginally do our interests and theirs coincide. And you don't approve this to approval of anyone. You don't bring it to the Knesset. You don't bring it to the relevant committees. You don't consult your own security cabinets. And this reinforces people's criticisms of Netanyahu. And of course, it's possible to hold both views. There are any number of Israeli commentators who say, yes, he's a magnificent statesman, and yes, he's a disaster domestically, because also hanging over all of this are his looming prosecutions, right? And it's part of why he's been desperate to change the subject. It's why he's been willing to go to elections time and again. It's why he's willing to do anything to survive. And this is the last point I would make. And this is where I have a question mark. Netanyahu's hallmark, to my mind, and I think others on this panel would agree, is that he has this mix of sort of tactical audacity and strategic caution, right? He will do anything to survive another day. He'll do anything. He'll go to Bar-Ilan University and make a speech supporting a Palestinian state, and he'll go to Y Plantation and he'll sign agreements with the Palestinians if it gets him through another news cycle and maybe even through another election cycle. And then if he needs to denounce Israel's non-Jewish citizens as traitors, as fifth columnists, as, you know, people who like are out to destroy the state of Israel, he'll do that if it gets him through the next news cycle and the next election. He'll do, and yet he doesn't do big moves. He doesn't go to war. He doesn't do big peace initiatives. And now, you know, of course, he's relentlessly concentrated on survival, on sort of surviving this lawsuit. And yet, and this is where I have a question mark, and I'd be very curious to hear what the other panelists think. I sometimes think that he's sort of, again, also part of it, it's his concern for his own survival is obviously a politician surviving in his own skin, but he genuinely and truly believes that he's the only person who can lead Israel in this tumultuous world, right? That only he has the chops and the vision and the historical insight and the understanding and the this and that to navigate his way. And for him, the best argument for that is his success thus far. So, but like my question is that he seems almost to be inching towards a strategy with this move, right? He's sort of fencing in the Israeli hard right and fencing in the Palestinians at the same time, not to advance anything, but to sort of as a way of like keeping them in limbo forever. And maybe this is as close as he gets to sort of large strategic thinking, that just sort of this is how he can freeze the status quo in place. I don't know. That's something I'm genuinely curious to hear about.
So actually, that's a good note on which to turn to Professor of Politics. Eva Bellin, you study the politics of the Arab world. Do you think there's going to be a domino effect here, and that this will lead to massive changes with future diplomatic agreements with other Arab states? What do you think the future holds? And then maybe we'll ask some of the others to comment on this question as well. But Eva, help us out.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And I have to say that I do not anticipate a major domino effect in the wake of these agreements. These diplomatic agreements that we've witnessed in the past month have really been driven by two calculations. One is strong state interest, and second is low domestic political risk. And by strong interest, I mean, I'm referring to what Tamara and Gary both mentioned, strong interest in finding an ally that would protect them against threat from Iran. And low domestic political risk, I mean that the country does not face significant political threat from popular disaffection due to cozying up to Israel. And frankly, there are only a very few Arab states that fit this profile, that meet these two conditions. You have some small states in the Gulf who are very concerned about the threat from Iran. And these very same states face very limited political risk in taking the steps toward recognizing Israel because their populations are small and because the state enjoys a huge resource advantage in being able to repress and co-opt and control popular discontent. These two conditions do not hold in most Arab countries, okay? They do not hold in Syria or Iraq or Lebanon or Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco, etc. Most of these countries are not looking for alliances to protect them against Iran. And most of these countries have large populations relative to state repressive and co-optive capacities, large populations that are strongly opposed to any rapprochement with Israel. What's interesting is the Saudi case, which kind of falls in the middle here. And the question is whether Saudi will jump on the bandwagon. Clearly, Saudi Arabia has an interest in making an alliance with Israel for the same reasons that the other Gulf states do. And of course, Mohammed bin Salman has been a norm breaker in the past and has shown irritation with Palestinians and has said things about Israel, Jews having a right to a homeland. So there are reasons to think, yes, that Saudi will move, jump on this bandwagon. But I'm a little less persuaded that that's going to happen in the immediate future, because we have to remember that Saudi Arabia also faces the constraint, the second constraint about risk right now. There is a significant portion of the population that would strongly oppose any rapprochement with Israel. And Saudi Arabia right now is facing some very serious economic difficulties due to the low price in oil and due to COVID, which has reduced religious pilgrims to the country that represent an important source of income for the country. So this is really a dangerous time for the regime to take what might be a very unpopular move. Overall, I think it's very important to realize that at the popular level, there has been no shift towards an embrace of Israel. Historically, the hostility toward Israel is deep, and it continues to run very deep. And what's really interesting is this is even true in the UAE. So the UAE is the country that has taken this dramatic step, and yet my colleague at the Washington Institute, David Pollack, ran a public opinion poll, And he found that 80% of Emiratis are opposed to any popular rapprochement with Israel. So the only reason why you see the UAE able to go forward is because Mohammed bin Zayed can afford to ignore what the population wants, right? Because he is so wealthy, he has such resources, both repressive and financial, that he can ignore what the people want. But that's not the case for King Mohammed VI of Morocco. It's not the case for President Tebboune in Algeria. It's not the case for President Kais Saied in Tunisia, etc. So frankly, the only countries I see likely to jump on this bandwagon are perhaps Oman and maybe Sudan. People have been talking about Sudan. Sudan is being pushed in this direction by its UAE patron. But even in Sudan, there's a lot of serious popular opposition to making a rapprochement with Israel. And the government is so divided, I don't know that it's going to have the courage to take a step in this direction before 1922, before its 2020, before its elections. So my bottom line is this. We have to recognize that the hostility toward Israel remains very, very strong at the popular level in the Arab world. This is not going to be diminished without significant progress on the Palestinian front. And so to my mind, the most interesting question is, what impact will these diplomatic agreements have on rapprochement between Israel and the Palestinians? Will we see the difficult situation that this is putting Palestinian leadership in? Is that going to break the paralysis that has plagued the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian community for the past decade and a half? And will that in turn lead to new initiatives on the part of the Israelis? I mean, what Khalil said is very disappointing, but who knows? Maybe the desperation of the times will push things forward. But again, that is the most intriguing thing for me to watch, what happens on the Palestinian-Israeli front. And that, what to my mind, will be most important in shaping the potential domino effect of these agreements.
So I wonder, Gary, Tamara, Eva is much more negative on these than, say, President Trump or Jared Kushner or some others we hear in Washington. Do you fully agree? I see your hand, Gary, so we'll go to you first with this analysis, or do you want to dissent in part?
Well, in support of Eva's analysis, the Trump administration made a very strong diplomatic effort to try to line up additional countries to join the UAE on stage. And you'll remember Secretary of State Pompeo traveled around the region trying to find additional countries. President Trump made phone calls, including to the King of Saudi Arabia, and that only produced Bahrain. And clearly that was, I think, in large measure, a gesture by the Saudis to show that they supported this initiative, but were not prepared themselves, for the reasons that Eva suggested, to actually take that step. If we're going to talk about particular cases, I mean, clearly Qatar, which has been forced into an alliance with Iran and Turkey because of its dispute with the Saudis and the Emiratis, clearly they're not going to normalize relations with Israel, at least as long as their dispute with the other Gulf countries continues. One result of it seems to me, one result of the normalization agreement may increase pressure on Saudi to try to finally resolve the squabble with Qatar, which would be another way to improve Riyadh's image in Washington, but might also open the door to gradually lure Qatar away from its relationship with Iran and with Turkey. Oman is fascinating because you'd think Oman would be an easy case to normalize relations with Israel, since the Omanis have maintained relations with Israel for a long time, including an open visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu last year. I'm guessing, and this is just purely a guess on my part, that the Omanis who want to maintain a position as a moderator with Iran, I'm guessing that the Iranians made clear they would be very unhappy if Muscat formally normalizes relationship with Israel, and that may have led the Sultan to decide not to go ahead at this point. So I think Eva's basically right that we're not going to see a lot of dominoes falling in the immediate future. As I said, when Mohammed bin Salman becomes king, that might very well change the formulation and calculation in Riyadh and lead to Saudi Arabia going ahead. But that will depend on so many other factors, including the state of play with Palestine. Obviously, if there's progress on Palestine, it makes it much easier for the Saudis to say yes. Or if they can extract some commitment or progress on Palestine, it provides them with a justification. And it will depend on US-Iran relations and many other factors.
I want to let Tamara weigh in here, and I want to invite people where after that we're going to go to your questions. So this would be a good moment to send any in. Tamara, what do you think? You're sitting in Washington.
Right. So I don't think I fundamentally disagree with Gary and Eva on this. I think the constraints that Eva noted about popular sentiment are real. And although most of these Arab governments have managed to survive the uprisings of the last 10 years, they are more sensitive to public opinion now than they've ever been. They have to be. And so the Omanis, for example, you know, the new sultan is still consolidating his position. So this is not a time he's going to take a risk like that. But I think Gary's absolutely right that, and I think we already see in Washington a new push by the White House to try and resolve the GCC rift. And we'll see if that may have some impact with Qatar. I wouldn't cross Qatar off the list. To me, the real tragedy of the way the Trump administration is playing what is otherwise a very nice hand for them is that by putting so much pressure on the Sudanese, and they're really twisting their arms, they may be endangering a very delicate domestic political process in Sudan. Sudan is, you know, at the very beginning stages of a potential pacted transition to democracy. And what the US is doing, knowingly or unknowingly, by pressuring the Sudanese, is giving the Sudanese military and their Emirati patrons, as Eva said, the upper hand in a domestic conflict. That's not helpful for Sudan's democratic transition. And so the Trump administration may be risking an incredibly strategic democratic gain on the Horn of Africa for the sake of normalization with Israel. That would be a shame. More broadly, I would say, you know, a lot of the theories about how this will affect the Palestinian-Israeli dynamic are premised on the idea that because the Palestinians are isolated and weakened, they will change strategy. And I think what I heard from Khalil and what I see so far is that that's not right. The Palestinian leadership is digging in further. It is also worried about domestic survival. And so there's a process of outbidding going on, not moderation. So if this is going to have an impact on the Palestinian-Israeli dynamic, I think it will be through Israeli society and Israeli politics, not through the Palestinians. I think if Israelis feel like they have this new opening from the Gulf and they have something to gain, but also something to lose if they don't move forward, that may shift the political balance in Israel, not immediately, but maybe over time.
Great. So I think this would, on that note, be a good moment to turn to the audience. I'll invite my colleague, Professor Kaye, who's been busily reading through 33 questions. We will not get to them all, but perhaps you can ask the most pertinent.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and everybody. Yes, we have lots of questions that came in during the discussion, including a couple of pages that came in even before the video began today. And I've done my best to sort of group them into buckets of questions that I can perhaps direct to each of you. So I apologize in advance to those in the audience whose questions may not be directly answered, but hopefully there'll be something of interest to everyone who did submit a question. So one question that came up in a variety of ways a number of times, Tamara, is regarding the American involvement in this whole peace deal. How responsible was President Trump for all of this? How responsible was Jared Kushner for all of this? Or to put it bluntly, as one of our questioners did, does President Trump deserve the Nobel Peace Prize?
I'll try to be brief. The genesis of this was between the Emiratis and Israelis, not in the White House. I think the White House deserves credit for when they were made aware of the opportunity, pursuing it with alacrity. At the same time, I think these controversies that we're now seeing emerge over F-35s and Israel's qualitative military edge and, other states, will they or won't they? All of this is evidence of the real incapacity of the Trump administration in doing the nitty-gritty of diplomacy. They announced it hurriedly because they wanted to get the Kamala Harris pick off the front pages and change the subject. They pushed for a signing ceremony before the parties had agreed on a whole lot of the details. And then they were willing to bring the Bahrainis in when the Bahrainis didn't even know what they wanted to ask for in a bilateral negotiation. And so there is still the risk that these misunderstandings could lead the deal to fall apart. I think it's unlikely because it's happening for very strong reasons we've described. So they get credit for following up, but they followed up badly.
Okay.
So this is a question now for Gary. You spoke a little bit about one of the key elements to this whole deal, which is the question of arms and arms sales. A number of people asked about that in different ways. What does this mean for Israel's military edge in the region? Might it lead to some kind of arms race among other states in the region or more globally?
So those are all very good questions. As most people know, by law, the US has to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge in conventional weapons. And as I suggested, the US is now engaged in negotiations with Israel in order to agree on provisions that will maintain Israel's conventional advantage while the US goes ahead and sells the F-35s to the UAE. You'll remember that when the agreement was initially announced and it emerged that the sweetener was an offer of F-35s, Prime Minister Netanyahu, at least initially, said that he knew nothing about this and that he was strongly opposed. But that was very quickly corrected by other participants who said, no, in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu was very aware that the sweetener was on the table and did not object to it. So the Israelis, I think, are not in a position to object. Instead, they're seeking compensation. And the Trump administration, which likes to sell weapons in any event, I think is going to be quite happy to try to work out some arrangement with Israel so that the sale can go forward without jeopardizing Israel's position. A deeper question is what other countries will demand. I mean, presumably, now that Israel has F-35s and the UAE very likely may receive them, you can imagine that other countries in the region, including countries that have a peace treaty with Israel, like Egypt and Jordan, might want them as well. So at some point, the administration will have to make decisions about selling these advanced systems to other countries in the region. And keep in mind, this is all taking place at a time when the international arms embargo against Iran is going to expire in the middle of October. Now, of course, the Trump administration has threatened to sanction any country that sells weapons to Iran. And there are lots of uncertainty about what weapons the Russians and the Chinese in particular would sell to Iran. But certainly on Iran's shopping list will be advanced airplanes, because the Iranian Air Force is very antiquated. Many of the aircraft really date back to US weapons sold to the Shah. So at the same time that the UAE is building up its capacity in terms of its Air Force, we can expect the Iranians to try to acquire more advanced airplanes. And I think we will see a arms race in the region as countries on both sides are able to acquire more advanced weapons.
Thanks, Gary. And your the last comment that you made, emphasizing the role of Iran in all of this, actually prompts me to ask a question, a version of which was asked by a number of the audience. And this is for Eva, to whom I apologize in advance for the breadth of this question, and please do with it as you will. Because the main players that are being talked about in the conversation so far are obviously Israel and the UAE, the Palestinians, the United States, and Iran. Some countries that have not been as prominent in the discussion include Turkey within the region, and beyond the region, another major global player, of course, is China, which is pursuing all kinds of interests in the region. And I wonder if you'd care to talk about any piece of that larger question.
Well, I can venture to say something about Turkey. I have to say that China is outside of my bailiwick. But I mean, Erdogan has come out quite forcefully condemning these agreements, which is not entirely surprising. I mean, his relations with Israel have been very bad for the past decade, even more. And he, like Qatar, identifies with anybody who's sort of Muslim Brotherhood oriented, is supportive of various forces in the Palestinian camp, and is hostile towards any kind of peaceful negotiation with Israel at this time. And that speaks to his base. I mean, he is very attentive to his popular base. So he is very negative about this. But I would bet that Tamara can say something about China, since her bailiwick is the entire world. So maybe we can ask Tamara to talk about China.
China is actually an interesting case because the Chinese government and Chinese business have been doing quite a bit of relationship building, both in Israel and in the Gulf. And it's actually been a source of a degree of concern from Washington to see its close partners doing deals with the Chinese. So for example, a Chinese firm has a contract to manage the Haifa port, which is where America's Mediterranean-based fleet likes to go for port visits. What does it mean for Chinese employees and a Chinese company to have potential access to American ships and sailors? Likewise, if we sell F-35s to the UAE also buys weapons and has trainers and technical advisors, military, from China. How do we make sure that those Chinese personnel don't get access to F-35 technology? So it gets very fraught very quickly. And I think this is an example of the kind of knock-on effects of a deal like this that perhaps were not fully thought through in the ebullient rush for a signing ceremony on the South Lawn.
Maybe a last question, Alex. Yeah.
So yes, we have time for two more short answers. Yehudah, just a heads up, the last question I'm gonna ask in 2 minutes time is, what effect do you think this will have on the US elections? But before that, I want to turn to Khalil just briefly, please. You painted, of course, a very glum picture for Palestinians in the aftermath of this deal and in general these days. Do you think there are any strategic openings for Palestinians here in terms of new leadership, new goals? What would you like to see happen?
Well, what I'd like to see happen is not going to happen. What is likely to happen, however, is that weaker Abbas might be forced to make a deal with Hamas. If he does, he will also have to go to elections. This will certainly be very good for the Palestinians. But in terms of the regional realignment that I spoke earlier about, if that happens, then Turkey becomes one of the most important countries for the PA, one of the most important backers. Turkey is not a friend of Egypt or Saudi Arabia, but these are, up until today, Egypt and Saudi Arabia have been the two most vital allies for the PA. So domestically, we might see things moving in a very good direction, national reconciliation, national unity, elections, and so on. But in terms of foreign policy, this could mean dramatic changes for the Palestinian Authority in its relations with its neighbors.
Thank you so much.
You want to take that last question? We have about 1 minute.
Right.
You're mute, Yehudah.
Right. Okay. There we go. Yes. 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 Okay. So sort of analogous to what I said about Israel in terms of U.S. electoral politics, this doesn't change all that much. You know, American Jews, I mean, have had extremely stable views of Mr. Trump, pro or con, for years now, and I don't see that changing much. At the margins, you could see some American Jews who perhaps have been sort of looking for, it's perhaps like makes people a little less inhibited about voting for Donald Trump if they're thinking of maybe voting for him anyway. And that's not terribly electorally significant other than the fact that we're talking about largely suburban Jews, a number of whom live in Florida, Miami, Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So there it could marginally have some effect, but I don't see a whole lot where I think it also, this isn't huge, but I think one thing it does drive home in terms of internal American Jewish political discussion and debate is that with something like this is no matter what you say, and with all the caveats and the issues and the problems and the questions that everyone has so skillfully brought to the surface here, this is a good thing, right? In the end, in terms of is something good for the Jews, yes, a large Arab country willing to openly normalize relationships with Israel. Yeah, that's sort of like your grandmother's definition of like something that's good for the Jews, which means that Jews in the U.S. who are in terms of internal Jewish debates about why Donald Trump is bad for the Jews, Jews making that argument need to take this into effect. Why is, despite all of this, and we've heard some reasons for qualification.
All right, well,
I want all this. Do you think this is not good for the Jews? So that's the effect it has, if any.
I want to thank the panel. We talk at Brandeis about truth, even unto its innermost parts. I think we've gotten to a lot of those innermost parts, and I'm happy to turn it back to the president. Ron.
Thank you, Professor Sarna. Thank you to all the panelists for this. We could barely scratch the surface of this very complicated issue, but I think all the panelists have given a lot of us a lot to think about in terms of what to think about when it comes to this agreement. Although small countries made these agreements, it has huge consequences both here in the United States and in the region. So I want to thank everyone for this participation. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to more of these events, and best of luck to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.